Hi, this is Dr. Santos again. We are beginning Module 2, and this week we're going to be focusing primarily on Egypt. We'll hit a little bit of some of the other cultures from the rest of the Near East. Next week, we'll start to pull all the things that we've studied so far into one giant understanding of the Near East, and we'll bring in some stuff about Israel. But this week we get to look at ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt does tend to be one of the most popular areas to study. It has a really long history of archaeologists and historians going there and looking for stuff. It was one of the major places where people wanted to go to find things from biblical history. So Egypt became very popular. It was one of the earliest places that was really put on the map in terms of doing archaeology, and it's because it's a pretty cool place to go. So as we start out, I did want to just jump in and look at this table of nations briefly, and I just want to point out there's a whole bunch of other cultures that we're not really going to spend a lot of time on. See, we have Egypt down here. We're on Sumer, but remember, there are Canaanites, there's Amorites. We're going to be touching on some of these as we go, but we're way back here. We're looking at the oldest time periods possible and blending in what we know and what we understand. So let's get started with Egypt. Egyptian civilization, it really began around the Nile. You can see on this map here, here's the Nile River, and you have Lower Egypt here, and you have Upper Egypt, and everything's divided by the Nile, and it really had to do with the fertility of their farm ground, and it was the Nile that kept their croplands to be as fertile as they were. So Egyptian gods, they're very similar to human beings, and they can even grow old and die. And developments in the Egyptian religion arose primarily from political turmoil. There's always this turmoil, especially between Upper and Lower Egypt, and it's later in their history that it actually becomes a unified kingdom. That was the idea. There was always a divided kingdom. So religious culture reflects a duality of life, both here and in the afterlife. So, meaning almost two sides of the same coin. Pharaoh ruled on earth. The underworld held a full life for some. And what we see is it's a lot like Mesopotamia. It's a pretty dreary place for them, the way they perceive what the afterlife is going to be like. So not a lot of excitement about it. Here's a broader map of covering more of the Levant here. So we pick up a bigger portion of Near East, North Africa. So Egyptian civilization grew up along the Nile River. Its primary focus and source of life. The Egyptian civilization began as a series of Neolithic settlements established along the Nile. So when we talk about Neolithic, we're talking about the first people that go out after the flood and begin to build civilizations. So civilization stayed right along that river. That's not that different from Mesopotamia either. Just Mesopotamia had two rivers, and those cultures, ancient Sumer and the rest of them, grew up in a similar kind of fashion. So farming techniques improve late in that Neolithic era, and including use of plows and draft animals. They learned how to irrigate. They learned how to drain land. People lived in homes of mud bricks, but the late fourth millennium, we're really talking about is just the first few generations after the flood. We're looking at that group of people. They start to develop these small territories, and we would call them more kind of like regions, maybe like counties, and start to develop governments. Ancient Egypt is divided into Old, Middle, and the New Kingdoms. So Egyptian religious culture arose and developed during those early years of the kingdom. And according to Egyptian tradition, Upper and Lower Egypt were united by Menes in about 3000 BC. So he identified as, took the idea of two kings and put them together. He was the first person to do that. Founded the first dynasty, and the gods were thought of primarily in this anthropomorphic terms, so very human-like. So Egyptian gods were subject to change in function and appearance to suit their believers' changing needs. So you could literally just change your god into a different appearance. What we're going to see is these Egyptian gods, a lot of synchronism happens. And later as they go out, especially after the Hellenistic period, we see these religions leave Egypt and go into other communities, other cultures and societies. And sometimes they get new names, sometimes they don't. So both gods and human beings had a beginning in time and would have an end in time. The gods were the product of sexual unions and formed their own family units. So they do have families. We're going to look at a couple of creation accounts as they understood them. We're going to see that there's a couple different ways in which they thought creation took place. So they have a lot of different stories. And the first one we start here is this idea of a cosmogonies, or creation accounts that explain how the world came to be. So they highlight 4 methods of creation: crafting, combat, generation, and speaking. So just the spoken word doing it. And for example, in the Heliopolis story, Atum stands on the mound and creates other gods through the act of divine expression. In another story, godly couples give birth. And in Thebes, they had a little different account where humans are created by the divine craftsman Noom. And in Memphis, Ptah creates the world by speaking his will into existence. So all these stories seem to reflect variations of central creation narratives in ancient Egypt. Seems to me, like we talked about with in previous classes and last previous module as well, seems like they have similarities, probably because there was one actual account that after the Tower of Babel they were spread around the world, and they developed their own flavor as the time went by. So creation stories tend to follow certain forms and patterns in the ancient religious cultures. Creation stories fall under the category of cosmogony, which we mentioned, and they are the accounts that they have. They're trying to tell the story of how did we get here? Why are things like they are? Much more so than telling any kind of accurate historical account. Like we said, multiple means of creation. So Egyptian creation mythology focused on key ideas such as creation, being the deliberate work of a god, often self-generated one. In Egyptian myth, 3 essential powers are needed for creation: divine utterance, magic, and divine knowledge. Atum One of the central figures is believed to have initiated creation in the Heliopolis story, and he stands on a primeval mound in the waters of chaos. So there's always this idea of chaos, and the god, through creation, putting an end to the chaos, bringing about order. So we're always trying to go from chaos to order. He creates other gods, these elemental gods such as Shu, which is air, tough, not moisture, gave rise to other gods, and ultimately forming a political and social order. They have families. Another creation account from city of Thoth. It's who was the god of the moon and wisdom. Here are the agents of creation. They're a group of 4 pairs of gods and goddesses, and they existed initially as entities within the primordial sea. So you got chaos again. The 4 couples were essentially male and female, aspects of the same principle. So you'd have a male god of the sea and a female god of the sea or water. So they have these groupings. So the 4 couples were essentially male and female aspects of the same principles as revealed by their names, and they have masculine and feminine forms of the same word. So from these 4 couples comes an egg containing the god who is responsible for the creation. In some versions of the story, is Thoth, who stands on Ben Mound and creates the Ogdod. So an interesting variation on Egyptian creation stories comes from Thebes, focusing on the god Noom, who is portrayed as a ram-headed man, craftsman who's a builder of ferry boats and ladders, and he is responsible specifically for the creation of human beings, which he did on a potter's wheel. Here we see Amun became the dominant god of Egypt during the New Kingdom when he was designated the transcendent creator. Amun was originally a sun god, but he gained this great unparalleled power over the other gods. And he's believed to be not only king of the gods, but also the divine essence found in all gods. Amun is understood as self-generated. He's active in creation as the impulse of the creative energy promoting the Ogdod into action. So he becomes the primary god. So finally, we have an example of creation by word in the creation story of god Ptah, who was worshipped from the early dynasty era, but his distinctive role as the patron of artisans, that ends up coming later. It's not something that was originally part of his character or nature or mythology, but he is chief god of Memphis and came to prominence in the 4th dynasty. And he's usually depicted as a mummified figure holding a scepter representing life, stability, and omnipotence. And he creates by speaking a word, giving spirit to a divine idea, and breathing it into being. So we can see how they have some similar ideas to what the biblical account has. And so, like I said, some of these things come about later. So it makes it interesting to consider where these accounts may have come from. There appears to be one master creation narrative that all these other accounts come from. And before creation, there existed this primordial sea and the dark waters of the abyss. and this mound grows up, and you kind of already heard that. So there's some key gods in this account: Shu and Tefnut, Geb and Nut, Osiris and Isis, Set and Nephthys, and a creator god from the Aeneid, the 9 principal gods. Okay, so they have this set number and a set group. So I'm not going to go through this. I did provide you with a worksheet, a handout that has the Egyptian pantheon listed out with a summary of a couple things. And I'll also listed out a few of the key works that we'll be talking about, and we may go through that as part of a lecture video as well. So there is this hierarchy of gods. There's no single obvious way to categorize the gods of ancient Egypt. And it's part of that is because they're always changing so much. And especially once you get to the Hellenistic period, when they start to export specific gods in those mythologies, they really change their nature. What you'll see is the one that really stands out is the goddess Isis and her story, because it was a compelling story for ancient people. She originally represented just a fertility goddess, a mother goddess, and you start to get this mother-child religion develop around her. So some really interesting things to consider when we look at Isis. So one group of gods with significance for all Egyptians consists of the funerary deities. So the earliest god of the dead in the underworld seems to have been the jackal-headed god Anubis. So Egyptians become very concerned about the afterlife. So a large majority of their mythology develops into what comes in the afterlife and how to exist in the afterlife, how to make the afterlife better is kind of what they get to. But they have lots of different gods involved in that. And Anubis is just one. Later on, Osiris will be a key figure in that as well. And Osiris becomes the god or ruler over the underworld. And Isis is going to be the one that takes, especially the spirit, but especially the spirit of a noble person like a pharaoh, and make sure he transfers directly and does well in the afterlife. So, like I've been trying to get at, duplication and overlapping of divine function is particularly clear among Egyptian solar deities, and really among all of their deities. So the primary example of historical change and development is found among the Egyptian solar deities. So you're going to get Ra, but then you get Amun, then you get Amun-Ra. So this squishing of them together. So the primary example of historical change and development is that specific group. Different Egyptian sun gods rose and fell in importance as a result of cultural factors, because the sun was a primary reality of Egyptian life. Sun gods were often identified as chief gods. They apparently had no trouble with these gods simultaneously representing the divine aspect of the sun. Different divine aspects of the sun were identified with different solar gods. Atum was identified with the sun as its setting, and thus was sometimes depicted as an old man, while others are represented through a scarab or a beetle, all these kinds of different images. Horus was the earliest of the sun gods and the chief god of Lower Egypt. The name Horus generally believed to mean the distant one and appears in many compound forms. Horus was represented as a falcon or a falcon-headed man, and often wearing a crown or a sun disk of some type. Horus inherited the heavenly throne after Osiris was murdered by Set, and providing a model for royal succession. And it's interesting, this starts in Egypt, but what you see is later on that the Hellenistic period, Greeks grab hold of this and start to use the same idea. And even Roman emperors grab hold of this idea of when one emperor dies, he is transferred to the underworld, but then his heir will have the deity, the royal deity, imputed on him. So he actually becomes God again. So the Pharaoh is always identified as God. Some later Roman emperors get identified as being God through the exact same mechanism. And that's why they love, in the Roman era, they love these Egyptian gods and mythology. So the dominant solar deity was Ra, especially during the early dynasty of the Old Kingdom. Pause, because we just said Atum was one of the dominant. These things change, and that's why eventually they squish the names together. So he's identified with the sun in its zenith this time, but also represents the divine essence of the sun. The creative power associated with the sun led to the identification of Ra as creator god. From the 4th dynasty, the pharaoh was called the son of Ra. One of Ra's names is Ra Horkathi, and it's Ra, Horus of the horizon, indicates this relationship. So such combination names indicate the unity of the divine power associated with the sun. Ra sailed across the sky each day in his royal barge and entered the underworld each night. Sometimes the sun's course across the sky was thought as mimicking the human lifespan. So we're back to Amun. Amun gained supremacy as Amun-Ra and enjoyed widespread exclusive worship. Amun was very early on a god of Thebes. And in Thebes, as Thebes became politically prominent, Amun grew more powerful and received the name Amun-Ra before, they say, about 2000 BC. So after the expulsion of the West, Semitic Hyksos rulers around 1500, maybe. We won't go too deep into that right now. But the worship of Amun-Ra represented the reassurance of native Egyptian power. So during the New Kingdom, worship of Amun-Ra came close to monotheistic practice, if not in theory. Power of Amun-Ra's priests led to an attempt to replace him with Aten, the solar disk, and devotion to Aten reached its height during the reign of Amenphis the Fourth, later known as Akhenaten. So Akhenaten tries to bring about this monotheistic religion, and it's probably interesting that there's a lot of speculation about this. Archaeologists that take the Bible seriously often look at Akhenaten as possibly the grandson of the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So would have been very aware of what happened in the time of the Exodus and the plagues and all those things that took place. And this idea, we should worship that God. They didn't quite have it figured out right. But I think it's a compelling story to think about Akhenaten trying to bring about monotheistic religion, and he gets outed. He is hated for it. So the Pharaoh is the center of Egyptian religious culture. Let's move that away. So he's first regarded as the embodiment of Horus and later the son of Ra. The Pharaoh was the enforcer of Ma'at, which is cosmic balance. Remember, we keep talking about Egyptians like this mythology of going from chaos to order. So that's what this is always about. Divine Pharaoh took a dominant place in the religious culture of the ancient Egypt, and so the king provided stability not only for his human subjects, but also for the gods. So that demonstrates how important he is within this society. So the divine honors afforded the pharaoh reflect his central importance to the entire cosmic order. So not even just the kingdom. So the primary role of pharaoh was to establish Ma'at, truth, order, cosmic balance. And Ma'at was both a principle and a goddess representing the ideal state of being. Ancient Egyptians were aware of sharp physical and spiritual contrasts that stood in tension, so like a tightrope pulling against one another. These things are not compatible, but they kind of make them work. So the pharaoh is necessary for both the good of humanity and the good of the gods. He exists simultaneously in divine and the human worlds and is necessary to both. The concept of Ma'at implies reason and decorum as the motivating focus of the pharaoh's actions, and each king was understood to be the one divine and eternal, ever-reigning pharaoh. The pharaoh's role tells us something concerning Egyptian ideas about the divine, and the pharaoh was considered to be an incarnate god during the first and second dynasties. So it has this idea of each pharaoh having this moment of ascension, and that becomes a very important part of what they have there. So the myths of kingship. This is just the basic explanation for both the divine and the earthly order. The divine model for Pharaoh's rule was the contest between Horus and Set for kinship. So it goes back to that mythology, and in that mythology, Set actually kills Horus, chops him up into pieces, spreads him around the world, and fortunately for our buddy Horus, his wife went out and gathered up all the pieces. Since she is a sorceress, her name is Isis, she is then able to resurrect him, and then they go back and they can finish the battle and are able to then be victorious over Set. There are a few other details in that. There's some more graphic parts that I've left out for you. So, but that's where they get the story of Osiris is tied to fertility of crops provided by the annual flooding of the Nile. So they just put all these things that are important to their survival, they put into their mythology. And this just tells a little bit more about the Isis and Horus account of the battle. So a little bit more about the underworld here. The Egyptians show more concern with preparation for the afterlife than any other ancient civilization that we know about. Their beliefs about the afterlife were particularly vivid and evolved over periods of centuries. So they put a lot of thought into this. They put a lot of detail into it. They're inconsistent at times, but they find a way to make those inconsistencies make sense within their mythology, at least to them. That's why mummification becomes so important, and for pharaohs to have tombs in which they can have the essentials for a nice afterlife left in that tomb. Egyptian civilization showed more concern with the next life than anyone known to us. We said that. The apparent preoccupation with death arises out of the primary sources for Egyptian culture, tombs. The abundance of material argues that concern with the afterlife was, in fact, central to Egyptians' religion. The Egyptians' vivid beliefs about the afterlife stands out among ancient cultures. Prehistoric religious cultures included belief in the afterlife. Earliest Egyptian burials are consistent with other Neolithic burials. Burials were gradually moved away from the villages, settlements, and homes of the living. And some scholars argue that belief in afterlife stems from the preservative qualities of Egyptian of the arid climate, so it's easy to preserve. Said that. So the practice of mummification involves an elaborate process carried out over weeks. Now, it's not always that elaborate. It's that elaborate when you had money. When you were a nobody, the process was much simpler and frankly a lot grosser, just to be fair. Basically, the process for a poor person was they just filled their body cavity up with oil, and then olive oil, then just let it drain out when it was time to bury them. It's pretty putrid. But tombs they get decorated, they are finished. And they had this expectation. Also left tombs were models of male and female slaves. So there's all this elaborate stuff around these tombs. Part of the preparation of the tomb was the opening of the mouth ceremony. The rituals for opening the mouth were performed on Ushbits, other human figures, and the mummy. These rituals included purification with water, animal sacrifice, and casting of spells. So when we start to look at the texts that we get information from, we have three primary sources of information. That's actually not listed here, but it's the pyramid text, Book of the Dead, and there's one other one. It's on your sheet. We can pull it up real quick. Here's sheet I provided for you has a list of all these gods. You want to keep this handy because you're going to be able to use it for your quiz. So what do we have? We have the pyramid text, we have the coffin texts, and we have the Book of the Dead. We can summarize them like this. The pyramid texts are royal focused on pharaohs inscribed on pyramid walls. Coffin texts are accessible to non-royals, and we find them on the coffins. And then the Book of the Dead, written on papyrus, accessible to everyone, and it has a bunch of the mythology is located in that text. So important work for us. All three of these are, but within your sheet you have a more detailed explanation of of each one. So I'll let you just look at your sheet to get this information. As you've seen, we do have both gods and goddesses. Goddesses play a major part within the mythology. Some Egyptian goddesses represented different elements of the divine order of creation. Goddesses played a major role in the process of creation. They are to some degree a reflection of the natural world. And it's, again, this duality, and part of that duality is male and female. So creation through sexual generation. And I mean, that's just more about the creation. We've covered that. That is on your sheet. That is on your sheet. And we've already been talking about Isis. She comes and is very helpful to her husband in eventually conquering, having victory over Set, and setting the kingdom in order. Yes, there really was, probably in the 70s, television show called The Secrets of Isis. I've not actually watched it, but I have watched the opening, and it's a great high school. She was a archaeology teacher in high school, and they got to do field trips all around the world. I must have missed that high school. Anyways, I've already given you the broad overview of Isis account. So what I didn't give you yet is Isis becomes the Queen of Heaven. So that gives us a direct link with other goddesses from around the world, but especially from Mesopotamia. Ishtar is one that's also the Queen of Heaven. And the interesting thing about Isis is she's able to take on any name of any goddess or even any god. She's thought to have been wise, but I want to say more than wise. She's extremely intelligent. She's crafty. She is a sorceress. And as a sorceress, she casts spells, works of magic, and she actually gains a large part of her power from tricking Ra. So she's able to learn his true name and then acquire his power. So that's what makes her so great. By the time we get to the Hellenistic period and Roman period, she's actually going to be known as the Queen of Heaven, but she calls herself literally God of Gods, and that makes the case that she is the one true God over all other gods. So later on, when we get into the parts of the Roman period, we'll give you some more details about that, and we'll read from the actual sources where we find that. But it's interesting, and I got interested in studying mystery religions because I wanted to understand the book of Revelation better. And these mystery religions, once you get into the Greek and Roman periods, become very popular. They are foreign religions, but become religions that, as a Roman, you can be involved in. And then the Roman emperors begin to use this mythology to maintain their own lines of royalty. So same thing the Egyptian pharaohs did. And we'll touch more on Isis in the future. So that is what we have for you this week. I pray that the Lord will continue to bless your studies here. Well, we're going to make when we come back to Isis, when we get down the road a little bit further, we're going to show you how some more of this stuff relates to the Bible as well, especially that phrase, the Queen of Heaven. So I pray that your studies are going well and that you're being blessed by them. God bless you.